All right. Hello again, adventurers, and welcome to another exciting episode of D&D Deep Dive, the show where we dive deep into classes, subclasses, and other features of 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons to help you get the most out of your choices. So, today, we are going to be starting a brand new Final Fantasy XIV turned into D&D 5e class. And this one is actually inspired by the D&D cross Final Fantasy XIV Reddit that I have a link in the description down below. It's where you can pick up the actual file itself. They have a link to it. It's where you can talk to the rest of the people that are into this. There's a pretty regular discussion about different classes and balance issues and theory crafting. It's a really cool place. And the actual creator that makes this and does all this amazing stuff is there too. So if you have specific stuff that you would like to talk to the creators about, you can do that as well. So definitely check it out. In addition, I'm going to try something different. If you like the stuff that I do, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon and turn notifications on to ensure that you always get these. I normally do that at the end. I'm going to try and switch it up and do it at the beginning, see if that changes anything. So that being said, I am going to be delving into another class that actually used to be my main in Final Fantasy XIV until a Gunbreaker came out in the Shadowbringers expansion. But I mained this class from Heavensward when it was first introduced all the way until Gunbreaker launched. And that class is the Dark Knight. So a little bit of background on the Dark Knight in general. First things first, just as I guess some transparency. I have for a couple years now been designing my own version of a Dark Knight style character. The class that I am designing is 100% inspired by the Dark Knight in Final Fantasy. Specifically, some lines from Final Fantasy IV that Cecil, the main protagonist of Final Fantasy IV, mentions at the very beginning, which is where he says something to the effect, depending on your the translation that you get, something to the effect of "I took up the Dark Blade for the king." Specifically, he took up being a Dark Knight because the king asked him to, despite the fact that being a Dark Knight requires him to sacrifice some of his humanity and some of his very life force to power the abilities that he has. And it makes him very powerful. He becomes, the head of the Red Wings, which was their kind of elite military force, and he becomes, basically second to the king before the game starts. He's the king's most trusted dude, with his best friend Kane kind of being third in line as far as trust is concerned. But the Dark Knight itself has a pretty long history in the D&D itself. The first Dark Knight that exists, or not D&D, in Final Fantasy. The first Dark Knight in the Final Fantasy series came in Final Fantasy II. In Final Fantasy II, you have technically four party members, but three of them, you only get to use three of them, with the fourth one being rotated until most of the way through the game, and you finally get your fourth party member, Leon, who is called the Dark Knight. Now, because of how Final Fantasy II works, Dark Knight wasn't really a quote-unquote class there as much as it was a background, because Final Fantasy II was skill-based, so the more you used swords, the better you were at using them. The more you used the fire spell, the more powerful it became. So you could make Leon really do anything. He came with, because he comes so late in the game, he came, I think, pretty good with swords. It's been a very long time since I've played, and I don't think I've ever gotten to Leon in Final Fantasy II. because I've never beaten it. But that was the first use of the word Dark Knight. Final Fantasy III actually introduced them as a class, where their main thing was creatures that could split if you could kill them, couldn't split if a Dark Knight hit them. But Final Fantasy IV is where the kind of modern interpretation of the Dark Knight in Final Fantasy really came to life. They could sacrifice some of their hit points to do a special attack that would hit all enemies, and they were, dark themed. As you went on, Final Fantasy V didn't have a Dark Knight. It didn't really, like, the class itself didn't really show up again until you hit Final Fantasy X-2. And then Final Fantasy XI had a Dark Knight class, and obviously Final Fantasy XIV has a Dark Knight class. And I think there was a Dark Knight in Final Fantasy, the third Final Fantasy 13. But anyway, so the idea behind a Dark Knight is basically you give up some of your humanity to gain additional power. This is the Edgelord's perfect class. And so a lot of the abilities and everything with the Dark Knight are going to kind of flirt around with this idea of giving up some of yourself in order to fuel abilities that make you more powerful, which I like. I like that from a lore perspective. I like that idea of, well, I have to make a sacrifice of myself in order to become more powerful for insert reason. There's a lot of different reasons someone might choose to do that. On one end, it could be that they chose to do this because they want to protect their family and for friends. They're doing it for someone else, very much like Cecil. On the other hand, they could be doing it just because they want power for themselves. They want, they want to be the most powerful, and they don't care how they do that. And there's a whole bunch of in-betweens in there as well. So I really, really like the lore behind it. As far as the mechanics, well, let's get to those. So, quick refresher on 5th edition class design. In 5th edition, every class is designed to play very differently right from the beginning. That's the whole point of having a different class versus a different subclass. In order to do that, they have these things that we call defining features. A defining feature is something that is either unique to the class or the class can do in a special way or has a unique way to use that ability that differentiates it from any other class. And in order for it to be a quote-unquote defining feature, it needs to show up within the first 2 levels. So let's break down the Dark Knight. Starting at level 1, you actually get your main defining feature of the Dark Knight right at level 1, and then going forward, you really don't get a second defining feature. Everything is kind of boiled into this one-ish defining feature, kind of. So you have something that looks to be more and more common with these Final Fantasy XIV classes is you do have a limited resource that they introduce. And the limited resource in this is called Well of the Darkness. Effectively, you have Well of Darkness points, which you have 1 point for every level of the Dark Knight. So it's very, very similar to the Monk's Key, is the best comparison you can make to current D&D. And you use these Well of Darkness points to fuel your Dark Knight abilities. Now, there will be times when you have to make abilities will force enemies to make saves against you, and you may have to make what's called a Dark Knight spell attack. Those are both charisma-based attack rolls and saving throws. So your Dark Knight spell DC is 8 plus your proficiency modifier plus your charisma modifier. And your Dark Knight spell attack modifier is your proficiency modifier plus your charisma modifier. So the Dark Knight theoretically can either go dexterity and charisma or strength and charisma, because this is a weapon-based class, so it does need one of those two things in order to be able to make its weapon attacks. You can't use charisma to make your weapon attacks, so you need either strength or dexterity. I've looked over this a few times now, and I'm drawing a blank a little bit. I think there's maybe one or two abilities built into the subclasses that prioritize strength over dexterity, but that's it. There's not a ton here that would force you to be strength and charisma or dexterity and charisma. So it does give you a little bit of flexibility as far as how you want to play your Dark Knight. In addition to that, you do have proficiency in all armor and shields and simple and martial weapons. So really the sky is the limit. If you want to be a dex-based Dark Knight, you can. You can wear light or medium armor and use finesse-based weapons, or you can go the heavier route and you can wear, heavy armor. And at that point, you would need a decent strength modifier so you don't lose your movement speed. So that's Well of the Darkness. I will talk about it at the end as far as my personal opinions on Well of the Darkness. But as we talk about how the rest of this class flows, I think Well of Darkness is not really necessary because they're introducing a limited resource, an additional thing to track, which in 5th edition, we don't want to do unless we have to. If there is a really important reason to have this thing be tracked, that's why key points exist. But for literally every other class, even paladins with their smiting ability, they use the spell casting feature in order to deal with that. They will co-opt a different feature and use it in a different way in order to give someone a limited resource as opposed to just creating a brand new one. And as we talk about this more, there's actually already a limited resource that they're using in this that I think is much better fit to the lore and the theme of the class, and I think balances it a bit better. That's Will of Darkness. The other thing you get at first level, and this is the big defining feature of the class, is called Darkside. As a bonus action, you may spend 1 Well of Darkness point to fill your weapon with power for a number of rounds equal to your charisma modifier. When you make a melee weapon attack while under the effect of Darkside, you deal additional necrotic damage as indicated on the class table. So, you have a Darkside bonus damage die, which just basically gets bigger as you level up. It starts as a D6, gets all the way to a D12 by the time you hit 17th level. So, this is not an unheard of thing in D&D. Matt Mercer's, I think is Blood Hunter. Wow, can I really not remember? Yeah, Blood Hunter. Wow, I can't believe that's slipped my mind. Matt Mercer's Blood Hunter class has something very similar where they have a damage die that gets bigger. My Dragon Knight class has a dragon damage die that gets bigger as you go, though mine starts a little bit smaller. This is a very, very common thing. To be perfectly honest, I like it. It means that critical rolls affect your bonus damage, which is always fun. A flat damage modifier like the Barbarian Rage is just not as much fun when you get crits into the things like that. So I do like that. And the idea of Darkside being not only tied to your charisma modifier, but tied to your charisma modifier for a number of rounds. A lot of things like the Darkside will be for a minute. Or something like that, a period of time. They don't generally measure multiple rounds, just because that does start getting a little bit confusing. And one thing that I will mention in general is whenever you're mentioning tracking rounds or turns or anything, you should clarify in your documents whether the thing ends at the beginning or the end of your turn. When it comes back around. So this is simply because that can change things, especially since with the Darkside, It lasts for a number of rounds equal to your charisma modifier, which means any opportunity attacks you make will be affected by Darkside. Or if you have something like a Battle Master of a fighter, where they can give out an attack to you, where you'll get to use your reaction to make a full-blown attack instead of an opportunity attack, that would be affected by Darkside as well. So now, the interesting thing about the Darkside is it mentions you fill your weapon with power for a number of rounds equal to your charisma modifier, which could very well be interpreted as anytime you use Darkside, you infuse a weapon with this Darkside ability. However, the actual wording of the mechanics is when you make a melee weapon attack while under the effect of Darkside, you deal additional damage. So this is any melee weapon attack you make. So Darkside actually works with two-weapon fighting. Whereas something like we mentioned the Blood Hunter before, they're infusions where they can add in additional damage. I cannot believe I cannot remember what these are called. Crimson Rights. That's what they're called. Crimson Rights. Their Crimson Rights work on a weapon, not on weapon attacks. So in order for them to use a Crimson Right while dual wielding, they have to actually use the Crimson Right twice. This is a one and done thing. So it does allow for you to make a dual wielding to the Dark Knight, which I like. The Dark Knight itself shares a lot in common with Death Knights from World of Warcraft, to the point where the modern kind of incarnation of the Death Knight in World of Warcraft, which is translated from special units from Warcraft 2, which were just the bad guy versions of Knights. The modern version of them that you can play in World of Warcraft is very, very much, at least partially inspired by the Dark Knight from Final Fantasy. That idea of giving up something of yourself to have more power, though their lore is vastly different. But the reason I bring it up, my favorite spec of the Dark Knight, the one that I played, that I mained for a little bit, is the Frost, because it's a dual wielding to the Dark Knight, or Death Knight, and none of that. I like having the two weapons. So in Final Fantasy XIV, your class is defined by your weapon, so you don't actually get a choice as to what kind of weapon you use in Final Fantasy XIV. All Dark Knights use Greatsword, because if you switch to another weapon, you switch to another class. So I like the fact that Darkside works with dual wielding. You can create a really kind of cool dual wielding the Dark Knight. In addition to that, because it's on every weapon attack, that does give a rather large benefit to dual wielding over using a two-handed weapon. Simply because at first level, it's just an additional d6 of damage. But that is effectively doubling your damage if you're dual wielding. To use numbers. If you're dual wielding at first level, more likely than not, you're either using scimitars or short swords. It's just the dual wielding weapons of choice in general. So both of those do a d6 of damage. With Darkside on, that's 2d6 damage for a single attack. If you're not dual wielding, and you're like sword and board, which is another very, very common thing, you'll be using a long sword more likely than not, which is a d8 of damage. So it's only an average of 1 damage more, and then you get additional d6 of damage. Being able to hit a gig again actually puts you into the range of like a greatsword, which is your kind of standard two-handed weapon. A greatsword is 2d6 damage. With Darkside, it would be 3d6. But if you dual wield two short swords, with Darkside, it turns into a total of 4d6 damage. 2d6, 1d6 each for the short swords, and then 1d6 each for the Darkside damage hit. So compared to most dual wielding options, where you can choose between dual wielding and two-handed weapon wielding, this does have a little bit more benefit for dual wielders, even at first level. When you get up to 17th level, where you're doing additional d12, the damage is absolutely not comparable. You're going to be doing a lot more damage dual wielding than you are single wielding all at the time. So yeah, that is level 1. At level 2, you get to the two things, and you get the kind of other, you could call it a defining feature. It just modifies the Well of the Darkness. But the first thing you get is fighting style. This is extremely common with weapon-based classes. Almost all of them will have a fighting style option. And the ones that you see here are super standard. This is the same ones that you see for literally everybody but the fighter. They are defense, dueling, great weapon fighting, protection, and 2-weapon fighting. So even the fighting styles kind of emphasize that you can build a dual-wielding Dark Knight, and it is kind of encouraged by the 2-weapon fighting aspect. So, yeah. There's not a whole lot we can say about this. I've covered fighting styles over and over and over in this. So if this is your first video, probably check out any of the fighter videos I've done, specifically the Tasha's optional fighter feats to learn a little bit more about the new fighting styles that aren't present here, or the original fighting styles. Just watch my original fighter D&D deep dive to get that. The other thing you get at second level is called Burning Blood. As a bonus action, you may expend one of your hit die and roll it. You recover Well of Darkness points equal to the result. You cannot exceed your maximum number of Well of Darkness points. So, by second level, you kind of have the other aspect of this class, which is you get to sacrifice your hit dice, which is what you use to heal yourself on short rests, in order to fuel your Well of the Darkness. Now, that does mean you effectively have as many run-throughs of your Well of Darkness points as you have hit die. So instead of having just one Well of the Darkness point, you technically have 2 Well of Darkness points at level 1 because you can use a hit die to get 1 back. All the way up until probably about level 6, almost any time you roll one of your hit die to regain Well of Darkness, you will regain the whole thing. Once you get around level 5 or 6, you have a much better chance of not getting your whole Well of Darkness pool back, but a massive amount of it back, which basically means the Well of Darkness is nowhere near as limiting as it seems to be. Again, it follows the same progression as Monk Key. And Key has already been shown to be a pretty effective limited resource. It prevents monks from becoming too overpowered, and it forces them to make choices about how to spend their key. Well of Darkness, once you add in Burning Blood, simply doesn't have that limitation. Well of Darkness, because you can refill it so easily and it's just a bonus action to do it, you can just burn through your Well of Darkness points over and over and over and over and over. And because your hit die is a D10 and that never changes, you will always be getting most of your Well of Darkness points back. And there isn't a single ability in here that uses more Well of Darkness points than you can get back in a single roll. And again, once you get to 6th or 7th level, you have 6 hit dice that you can use to fuel your Well of Darkness points. So the Well of Darkness points almost don't matter after about 4th or 5th level, because again, you have so many hit dice, and there's so many other ways you can regain hit points other than using hit dice, that a lot of people very rarely use their hit dice in D&D. You have classes that can cast cure spells. You can load up on potions. There's so many different ways you can heal yourself that using your hit dice entirely as fuel for your Well of Darkness is not going to be that big an issue. So that's my one issue with Well of Darkness and Burning Blood, is that it's simply, Well of Darkness is meant to be a limiting factor to the class, and it isn't. It might as well not be there at all, simply because, again, by around 4th or 5th level, you will never run out of Well of Darkness points. You just won't. It's so easy to get them back, and all of your abilities use maybe 1 or 2, that you're just never going to run out of them. Which, again, at that point, there's no real purpose for the Well of Darkness. And I have a suggestion that I'll do when I'm doing my final thoughts on this, as to how we can make the limited resource actually worth something. So yeah, that is 2nd level. 3rd level, you choose your archetype. There are 3 different archetypes. I will not cover them in this video. I'll have a separate video for each one of them, as usual. But the archetypes are the Black Blood, the Abyssal Knight, and the Dark Magus. 2 of them I think are actually really interesting, especially if you put in the modifications I'm going to mention during final thoughts. The 3rd one needs some work, and when I make the video about it, we will talk about that. All right, so 4th level is the normal 4th level ability, which is ability score improvement, or ASI. Effectively, you either improve one of your ability scores, you choose a feat. We've talked about feats, all that stuff, and again, depending on which flavor of Dark Knight you choose, you may want to increase your strength or your dexterity, and then obviously your charisma is very, very important in this as well. So this is a multi-attribute dependent class, but it's only 2, so not horrible. At 5th level, you get extra attack. We've talked about this many times. You attack twice instead of once when you take the attack action. It makes sense. It does benefit Darkside, because any additional attack you make gives you additional damage. It's always nice. At 7th level, you get the Blackest Knight. As a bonus action, you may expend 1 hit die to create a barrier which protects you or a creature within 30 feet of you. Roll the expended hit die. The target gains temporary hit points equal to the die result plus your charisma modifier. This specifically is a translation of an ability that is very, very enviable in Final Fantasy XIV, which is, surprisingly enough, called the Blackest Knight. I believe. It's been a while since I've played my Dark Knight, and I don't actually look at the names of the abilities anymore, so I might be wrong, but I believe it's the same thing. Basically, every tank has what are called cooldowns, which for tanking is effectively abilities that reduce damage you receive by a set amount. Generally, it's like 15% or 20%. Sometimes it's a little bit less, sometimes a little more. But they're used to basically make it so you can survive attacks that are meant to kill any other class. They're called tank busters. Blackest Knight is one of those cooldowns for the Dark Knight, but it's different. Instead of just reducing the damage you take by a percentage, Blackest Knight actually gives you a hit point shield. And what happens is, until that hit point shield is reduced, or I think 15 seconds could go up, you just don't take damage. It's absorbed by the shield. Basically the same thing as temporary hit points. And if it breaks, if an enemy hits you hard enough to reduce all of those hit points reduce the shield to 0 before the 15 seconds are up, you actually get a free use of your Darkside ability. Or you have 2 different attacks that you can do that activate Darkside, which just makes you do more damage. So that's kind of what Dark Knights in Final Fantasy XIV are based around, is this Blackest Knight, which you don't get until really, really late. But it massively changes how you play the class, because being able to, instead of just reduce damage, just not take damage for a little bit of time, or take a massive chunk of damage off of an attack, is massive. So seeing this translated to D&D, I think it's really interesting. Obviously, a D10 is not a ton of hit points, and as you get to higher levels, it becomes less and less useful, because you have a lot of attacks that are going to do more than the maximum you could ever get from this is 15 temporary hit points. And once you get to tier 3 content, most attacks are going to do more than that. I would actually like to see maybe around like level 14 or 15, allowing you to kind of upgrade the Blackest Knight to gain double the number rolled on your hit die, just so that it's still viable at higher levels. Again, going from a maximum of 15 temporary hit points to a maximum of 25 temporary hit points is not big enough to change that it's going to unbalance the game, but it is going to make you want to use the Blackest Knight, especially since you have to sacrifice a hit die to do it. So at lower levels, it's actually really useful. At higher levels, it loses its usefulness very, very quickly, and you probably won't be using it almost at all. So just that additional modification of somewhere between like level 13 and 15, letting you roll, or maybe even just as early as level 11, so that right when you get to tier 3 content, you also get the upgraded Blackest Knight stuff. Allowing you to roll double is going to make it so that even all the way up to max level content, you're able to get a benefit out of it that's useful. So yeah. At 9th level, you get Fight or Flight. Being at 9th level, you're able to spend 2 Well of Darkness points to cast the Cause Fear or Compelled Duel spells. Cause Fear, again, can be very, very useful, because it gives a target disadvantage on any attack rolls it makes, as long as it can see you, and it can't move any closer to you willingly. So Cause Fear can be incredibly useful as a control method. We talk about action economy all the time because of how important it is in 5th edition. Being able to force anyone that uses attack rolls, so this can be spellcasters or melee characters, melee enemies, being able to force them to make rolls at disadvantage can massively affect the battle. And being able to make it so that they can't move close to you, meaning you can position your Dark Knight to a place where a melee character actually can't get close enough to attack any of your party members. And you can simply use your Dark Knight as effectively a barrier. Compelled Duel is the exact opposite. The character can only fight you, which again, from a control perspective, can be extremely useful. But is much more about taking hits for another party member. And there's a lot of situations where both of those spells are going to be very, very useful. Now, the one kind of limiting factor of this, because again, as of right now, Well of Darkness points are not a limiting factor at all, is they both require your action to do. So if you do have to sacrifice doing damage to be able to do either of these. Even if you're a dual wielder, in order to make an offhanded attack, you have to take the attack action. So that is the major limiting factor. And again, I like that. I like the fact that you have to choose between doing damage or control, because it is a choice, not something where there's always going to be a definite right answer. If you give a player a choice, but there's always a better answer or a right answer, it's not a choice, it's an illusion. And this actually does give them a choice, which in my mind is good class design. At 10th level, you get Curse of the Abyss. On your turn, you may use a bonus action to curse a creature. The curse lasts for a minute. The curse ends when the creature dies, you die, or are incapacitated. Until the curse ends, you gain the following benefits. You gain bonus damage to your rolls against bonus to damage rolls against the curse target. The bonus equals your proficiency bonus. Any attack roll you make against the cursed target is a crit on a 19 or a 20 on the d20. And if the cursed target dies, you regain hit points equal to your Dark Knight level plus your Charisma modifier, and regain 1 Well of Darkness point. You must then finish a long rest to use Curse of Abyss again. So I've mentioned before, I'm not generally a big fan of one and done abilities because players will never use them. And the reason they don't is they will always look for the absolute perfect chance to use them, as opposed to a good chance to use them. Anytime they're going to use that ability, they're going to go, well, I only get one of these. So I could use it now, but what if another enemy comes along before we can rest that's even more powerful than this one? Or what if I need this in a situation later? No, I can't use it. And they end up going often without using that ability. So in general, the ability has to be useful and enough that it justifies having it be a one and done, to where they're not going to feel bad about using it at not the most opportune time. And I think this balances that well. Additional damage is always nice. The fact that it's a flat buff, I think is good, because Darkside is already giving you a die bonus, which on crits gets doubled. This is just a flat bonus, so that's nice. However, to deal with crits, it expands your crits, making it basically you have a 5% chance to kick a crit on a d20 to a 10% chance. So it is doubling the amount of crits that you get, which again, combined with Darkside, is really, really powerful. And then the last part of it, you get hit points back, and you gain a Well of Darkness point back. Well, again, Well of Darkness is not a limiting factor, so that doesn't matter now. But when we talk about the changes I think should be made, that will become a very, very big deal. And then you get hit points back, which is probably the most useful aspect of this, because, again, for Burning Blood, you have to use your hit die, and for Blackest Knight, you have to use your hit die in order to power it. Meaning anything that gives you hit points back is going to be useful, because you're not getting hit points back when you rest. So yeah, overall, I like Curse of the Abyss. It's one of the few one and done abilities that I think is useful enough that players are not going to regret not using, or regret using it at times other than the exact perfect time. I think this one will actually get regular use despite it being a one and done, and I don't think you need additional uses of it. Like, normally my recommendation for one and done abilities is make them two and done, simply because then people will actually use it. This doesn't need to be a two and done. I think it is useful enough in such a wide variety of situations that I think it will almost always be used in the adventuring day. So I like that. At 13th level, you get Abyssal Communion. You may spend 6 Well of Darkness points to cast Rary's Telepathic Bond, which effectively just gives your party telepathy for a set amount of time. I don't remember the exacts, but it's a decent chunk of time. I've mentioned this in other videos. Telepathy is massively useful in D&D depending on the range. But even short range telepathy is really, really useful in a number of situations. Probably the one most people will use it for is in a situation where you're negotiating with someone. Being able to tell your party members things that you can't say out loud because the negotiator will hear is insanely useful. And there are just a number of different situations where the ability to communicate without making any noise is just useful so many times. So the fact that it costs 6 Will of Darkness points and there's literally nothing else in the base class that costs anywhere near that is weird. It almost seems like this was just something that's meant to be a Well of Darkness sink, because again, Well of Darkness is not a limiting factor as long as Burning Blood exists, and you can get most of your Well of Darkness points back from a single roll. Yeah, you can always roll a 1 on your hit die and only get 1 back, but on average on a D10 you're going to be rolling a 6. That is the average roll of a D10. So as much as it can be bad, you're generally going to be getting 6 points back every time, and there's a chance you'll be getting up to 10 points. So even Abyssal Communion is just a single hit dice or hit die worth of Well of Darkness points. The other thing is, lore-wise, I don't really know why this is here. This feels kind of like we have a 13th level of ability and we don't really have something to give them for 13th level, and you never want to just give a player nothing but hit points for leveling up. That's very unsatisfying. So this almost feels like, as much as yes, it can be incredibly useful, it's just completely out of character for the class itself. There's nothing in Final Fantasy XIV that even hints at this ability. And it's a weird thing to give to a Dark Knight, which is all about sacrificing their own health and life force to be able to do additional damage, and sometimes psychically talk to all their friends. I mentioned before Blackest Knight. I think it would be better if it would double of eventually. This would actually be a really good place for that to happen. If Abyssal Communion changed to improved Blackest Knight, where you double your the temporary hit points, and even doubling the charisma modifier too. You get double hit die plus double your charisma modifier. Would you find? Because again, maximum that's 30 hit points. So it's not that bad. I would actually prefer seeing Abyssal Communion changed to improved Blackest Knight. Simply because, again, that means the Blackest Knight, which is a really cool ability where you actually get to sacrifice your hit dice to do something cool, is still useful in Tier 3 content right when it needs to be. And Abyssal Communion, as I said, the ability to speak telepathically is really, really useful, but there's other classes that it makes more sense for them to give you telepathic abilities than the Dark Knight. So while it's a useful ability, I don't think it fits the class very well. Going to 14th level, you get Quietus. As an action, you may spend 2 Well of Darkness points to make a melee weapon attack to all creatures within 10 feet of you. You may expend 1 hit die and roll it to deal additional necrotic damage equal to the results to all creatures attacked. So there's a lot to kind of break down here. First things first, use 2 Well of Darkness instead of 1, which again is a moot point because Well of Darkness points are not a limited resource. However, you do make a melee weapon attack to all creatures within 10 feet of you, which the wording for this is interesting. And I personally would interpret it as you make a single melee weapon attack and apply it against the AC of every creature within 10 feet of you, which I like. Most abilities that do something like that either would make you make a separate attack on each one, or what generally tends to happen, because this is just how 5th edition works, is you make a saving throw. Each creature will make a saving throw, so because you're technically not making multiple attacks against each one, which is what an attack roll is in 5th edition, is every time you roll an attack, you are making... Sorry, I had something on my lip for a second there. Every time you make an attack, you are an attack roll, you are making a new attack. So that's why fighters get multiple attacks. They're attacking so fast, they're going pow, 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 pow. They're just attacking really, really fast. So I like the idea that a single attack roll would apply to multiple creatures. If that's not how it's designed, I think it should be. However, because of how it's written, it's unclear. So this would be something where I would say, as an action, you may spend 2 Well of Darkness points to make a melee weapon attack against all creatures within 10 feet of you, and then add another sentence, roll a single attack roll, and apply the results against the armor class of every creature within 10 feet of you, just to further kind of emphasize this is a single attack. Because right now it's really unclear, and there isn't an ability in 5th edition that lets you do that. Everything in 5th edition is either a single attack roll against a single target or a saving throw. There isn't one where you make a single attack roll against multiple targets. And so most DMs would interpret that as multiple attacks, which I think would slow down combat a ton if there's a lot of creatures there. I like the idea. And it does fit with the ability. Being able to expend a hit die to do additional damage is cool. And it specifically says to all creatures attacked, not to all creatures hit. So this allows you to burn a hit die in order to do damage to everyone. Even if you miss the attack, based on the wording here, you will be able to just do damage to anyone that you attack with this. Now, limiting factor of this is all creatures within 10 feet, not all enemies, so you might hit your allies with this. So remember that. Most other abilities like this require a dex save, meaning if you have a monk or a rogue or a high-level ranger, specifically the hunter ranger, they might be able to get out of the damage completely by just making their dex save. This you can't. You're going to make an attack roll against them. So yeah, just remember that when you're using this. But I like limiting factors like that. And again, it does kind of make sense for the Dark Knight to have to choose whether he wants to sacrifice not only part of his own life force, but the life force of some of his friends possibly in order to do damage. At 15th level, you get Dark Mind. You gain proficiency in the Wisdom saving throw, which just makes sense, to be blunt. The Dark Knight itself has Constitution and Charisma saving throws are the ones that they're good at, which is fine. It makes perfect sense for this. Their Constitution saving throws are generally saving throws against being stunned and poison. And so making them really good at resisting poison makes perfect sense. And then Charisma, there's not a ton of Charisma-based saving throws in 5th edition. But when you do make a Charisma-based saving throw, it's generally against something bad. There's a couple, like, lose control of your character abilities that are Charisma saves. I think that's it. So it's limited in its just usefulness, but when you use it, it's super useful. Adding Wisdom to that, again, just makes sense. Especially for Tier 2 our tier 3 content, adding just an additional saving throw is nice. It's very, very useful, especially since when you're getting to higher levels, wisdom saves start becoming a much bigger deal, because things like hold person is a wisdom saving throw. A lot of charm spells are wisdom saving throws. Dealing with things like vampires and succubi will use wisdom saving throws to enthrall your character and things like that. So it just kind of makes sense to me that someone that's already kind of sold their soul will be harder to kind of corrupt. They're already corrupted by their own darkness. They don't need your help getting corrupted. So I like that. I think it's cool. At 18th level, you get Stalwart Soul. At the start of each of your turn, you regain hit points equal to 5 plus your Constitution modifier. If you have no more than half your hit points left, you don't gain this benefit if you have 0 hit points. Built-in regen is something that monsters do on a fairly often. And by fairly often, I mean there's like half a dozen monsters that have that. Maybe a dozen or two. And they are really, really fun for players to deal with, because watching wounds heal, I especially love describing it to my player characters, because it is a very demoralizing thing to watch the damage you've done go away. And that little bit of demoralization can be enough to just up the stakes in the fight that much more. So I love it in enemies. For character abilities, I generally prefer it to be limited. And this does have a limit where it only happens up to half your hit points, which is fine. Part of me thinks there should also be an activation cost and a limit to it. Like, maybe you can do this a number of times equal to your proficiency bonus, because that's become really, really popular. But because it's an 18th level ability, I'm actually kind of fine with it just being Dark Knights get a regen. You know, again, they're already using their hit dice for other things, so just letting them heal up to half hit points is kind of useful. Now, the kind of unintended consequence of this always being on is anytime they're out of combat, they will always heal back to half hit points, because each turn is 6 seconds. So every 6 seconds, they get 5 plus their Constitution modifier. So they will always have, at the start of every combat, they will always have bare minimum half of their hit points. That in and of itself does create a bit of an issue. That's why generally for player characters, it requires you to activate it in some way. And I think that would be the one kind of limitation. Maybe don't put a limit on it, but no, even then, if there's no limit to it, you will always have half your hit points. So, yeah, I guess I'm a little bit torn on it. Making it limited would mean that they actually have to watch their hit points between combat. But it also makes it less effective that it's an 18th level ability. I'm still going to say it should have a limit, and it should have an activation, even if it's just when you take the attack action, or as part of another action, so you don't have to burn that. But I could easily see this being a bonus action, since again, making it a bonus action makes it a choice, and then limiting it to probably your proficiency bonus, because by 18 that's +6. So it would give you 6 times to be able to use it, but it would mean limiting it to maybe a number of rounds equal to your proficiency bonus or something like that. For 6 rounds, meaning grand total, if you've got 5 and 5, so 10, you regain 60 hit points, which is still a decent amount. but it's not going to be so broken that Dark Knights effectively never have to worry about their hit points. Because they're always, as long as combat ends, they're always going to be brought up to half health. So that would be my only kind of modification to it is, yeah, limit it, force it to be something that you activate, and limit the amount of to the time that it lasts. Even if it's just limit it to a minute, that would still be better, because that's 10 rounds as opposed to 6. It would still be better than it just always being on. Finally, we have Living Dead. When you reduce to, and it's 20th level, by the way. When you reduce to 0 hit points, but not killed outright, instead of becoming incapacitated, you expend 1 hit die and recover hit points equal to the result plus your Constitution modifier. So effectively, this is a get out of death free ability. This starts to kind of flirt with how the difference between 4th edition and Final Fantasy XIV. In Final Fantasy XIV, I actually had this conversation with someone when I was talking about the Giga Gunbreaker. One of the videos on the Reddit, somebody was talking about the tether bracer and going, well, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. There's nothing similar to it in Final Fantasy XIV. I go, well, that's one of the reasons I like it, is there's nothing like it in 5th edition. It's a unique ability, and I think that's cool. They said, yeah, well, but what about the why doesn't the warrior or the paladin or anybody get something like that? You know, it doesn't make sense for the gunbreaker to get it and no one else. And in Final Fantasy XIV, that is true. Within your role, you will have basically your version of these same abilities. All tanks have a holy shit button. For Gunbreakers, it was Super Bolide. For Dark Knights, it's called Living Death, which works very, very differently from this. And I'm not going to get into it because Living Death is probably the most complicated holy shit button. For Paladins, I can't remember what it's called, but they just turn invincible for like 15 seconds. And then Warriors have one too. I don't play Paladin or Warrior, so I don't know them that well. But that's a very common thing in Final Fantasy XIV, is every class has their own flavor of the same abilities within their role. They even have these things called role abilities, which are abilities that every character in, or every class in that role has access to. For tanks, one of the role abilities is a cooldown, defensive cooldown. Another role ability, meaning every single tank has access to this, is a stun mechanic for interrupts. So this starts to flirt with that idea of all the tanks are going to have different flavors of the same ability, which in 5th edition is not how it works. And that's how I responded to this person. That's the difference between D&D and Final Fantasy XIV. D&D is meant to give every single class things that no other class gets. Does that mean that every single ability in 5th edition is entirely unique and is not shared by any others? No, it's not it at all. Paladins, a defining feature of the Paladin is their smite ability, but Hexblade Warlocks get a version of smite that they can take if they want it. Yes, there are mimic abilities in 5th edition to Dungeons and Dragons, but they are the exception as opposed to the rule. And that is the only thing I don't like about Little Living Dead, is the fact that this is literally just the holy shit button for Dark Knight. Which is fine. Like, the ability itself makes sense and it works really well. But as far as 5th edition class design is consulted, I guess it's not the right word, but it's the only one I can think of. As far as 5th edition class design, you shouldn't give every class a different flavor of the same ability that goes in the exact. It goes in the face of how 5th edition is designed. Earlier editions, you had that constantly. Fourth edition actually had what I called the Get Out of Death free card for every single epic destiny. Fourth edition was interesting because as you leveled up, when you got to a different tier, there were basically 3 tiers of adventuring in fourth edition. You had heroic tier, Paragon tier, and Epic tier. And the big change moment in them was you actually chose a subclass at each one of these tiers. Heroic, you would choose your base class, and there were many, many variations depending on the abilities, the powers that you chose, to where even base 2 people playing the same base class could play very, very differently. It's one of the things I liked about 4th edition. When you got to 11th level, you chose, or maybe it was 10th level. I think it was 10th level. One of those, you chose your Paragon path, which was a subclass that would be influenced by your class choice, sometimes your power or feat choice in there, and then sometimes your race or background choice. And you'd be given a list of Paragon paths that you could choose that would further kind of customize your class. Then when you got to 20th level, you would choose an Epic Destiny, which again was based on your class, and you generally would have like half a dozen to a dozen different choices that you could do. And it was really cool and really fun. But at level, I think it was 21 for almost every single class, you would get what I called a Get Out of Death free card, which was basically when you were reduced to 0 hit points, you would get an ability that will return you to life in some way. One of my favorite ones was a future version of you would step back in time and take your place for the rest of combats. So it would be like a supercharged version of your character that would come back in time and would fight in your place while your corpse was on the ground there. Or not corpse, or your unconscious body was on the ground there. And it was a really cool idea. But in 5th edition, they decided to go against that. And like I said, this flies in the face of 5th edition class design. If you give every single tank the same ability with slightly different flavor behind it. Now, is this a bad ability? No, I think it's really cool. It fits with the class itself. It allows you to burn your hit dice, sacrifice part of your life essence to, keep on fighting. It doesn't feel broken or anything like that. And with the modifications we're going to talk about in a little bit, it actually has a lot of use. So yeah, there's nothing wrong with it. And if Dark Knight was the only class that you were adding, I would be perfectly fine with it. But comparing it to the other, just comparing it to the Gunbreaker in that they both have an ability that allows you to get back up from 0 hit points, it's not 5th edition class design. I don't really have a suggestion to change it because it's a good, useful ability. But going forward, if you design more classes, which they're already starting to talk about designing the new classes that are going to be introduced in Endwalker, that's a huge no-no in the 5th edition, is you don't give multiple classes the same ability with slightly different flavor. It gets rid of the uniqueness of the class. The only kind of saving grace of this is it is a 20th level of ability, so the vast majority of players are never going to get this ability. 20th level content just isn't played in Dungeons and Dragons very often at all. So yeah, it's a cool ability. There's a lot of use. I've talked about it in the Gunbreaker video. The basics of it is anything that can prevent you from going to 0 hit points is useful. It's slightly overpowered as it is now, because as long as you have hit dice and you have 20 of them at the 20th level, you basically can't be knocked unconscious unless they kill you. So for the final thoughts, overall, The Dark Knight is interesting. I think it's a really interesting class. The one issue I have with it is Well of Darkness is a pseudo limited resource. Again, once you get to about 4th or 5th level, it's not a limited resource. You will always have Well of Darkness points that you can use throughout your adventuring day. There's no reason to conserve any abilities that use Well of Darkness. Use them to your heart's content. Because of that, there's no purpose behind Well of the Darkness. It's just not useful. However, if we change Well of Darkness points to just use your hit dice, that changes things massively. And that, I think, turns it into a limited resource. That, I think, turns it into a very, very interesting class. Again, right now, the only thing you use your hit dice for is regaining Well of Darkness points, which is almost a null, the Blackest Knight, and then Quietus. And then if you get to the 20th level, Living Dead. So that's 4 different abilities that each only use 1 hit die. And again, you get up to 20. There's really never going to be a situation, 20 per day, by the way. There's really never going to be a situation where you shouldn't use Blackest Knight or Quietus. You should almost always have it up, with Blackest Knight being the only one where you might want to rein it in a little bit, because theoretically you can use Blackest Knight every single to the turn and just go through your hit dice really, really fast. But other than that, there's no reason to really limit your hit die use. And there's no reason to limit your Well of the Darkness use. So if we change every ability that uses Well of Darkness, if we just change it to use a hit die instead, that turns this into a balanced class versus a class that is very, very unbalanced, because their one limiting factor is not limiting. So I would say get rid of Well of Darkness completely. It simplifies the class. You don't really need an additional thing to track. And again, the main idea behind 5th edition is limit complexity to just the essentials. Complexity for complexity's sake is a negative, not a positive. It's one of the reasons why 3rd edition scared away so many players and hurt D&D as badly as it did, because there was so much complexity to it that you couldn't get new players interested. It's one of the reasons why Pathfinder finally lost its spot as the kind of top RPG on the market. Because it is such an overly complex game. And it's the reason why 2nd edition Pathfinder is not nearly as popular as it could be, is because they took the complexity from Pathfinder and they dialed it up to 11 for Pathfinder 2nd edition, while trying to take some lessons from 5th edition, and it just didn't work. Because they missed the important part of 5th edition, which is you don't need complexity in order to have a really fun game. And complexity, for complexity's sake, takes away from the game, and it makes it harder to play. And that's what Well of Darkness is right now. It's a limited resource that isn't limited. It's just something that you have to keep track of for busy work, and it adds an additional aspect to the game that doesn't need to be there. If we completely get rid of Well of Darkness and just, again, just like the Paladin, use a system already in place. In their case, they use the spellcasting system. Use the system already in place, the hit dice system, as your limited resource. It will make the class play very, very differently, even from the Blood Hunter, which is another class that uses hit dice as a kind of resource for one of their abilities. Well, this will use hit dice for all of your abilities. It means when you're using your abilities, it is now an actual choice about whether or not you want to use them. And it does kind of fix the problem we talked about with Stalwart Soul, where you're always going to have half your hit points if you leave it the way it is. you're always going to have half your hit points at the beginning of every combat and counter. Um, because of that, making hit dice your main resource that you use does does actually give you a reason to not use your abilities. Which again, when we're talking about player choice in an RPG, if you give a player a choice, but there's always a right answer, that's not a choice. That's simply the illusion of choice, and it's adding complexity where there doesn't need to be any. If they're always going to make that choice, you don't even need to make the choice. Just turn the ability on all the time. But a lot of people use that illusion of choice to declare that, well, this is a limiting factor, so that this isn't overpowered because you don't always have it on. If it was always on, then it would be overpowered. Like Darkside, if it was always on, it would be overpowered. But because Well of Darkness is not a limiting resource, it is always on. So there's no real reason to have you activate it. Just leave it always on. There's no reason not to. You're always going to have it activated. So yeah, that would be my big change, is get rid of Well of Darkness, make them burn their hit dice for all the abilities. The only one that this would cause major issues with, which is Abyssal Communion, which again, my suggestion for Abyssal Communion is turn it into improved Blackest Knight. They don't really need that particular ability. They just don't. I would just say turn Abyssal Communion into the Blackest Knight, improved Blackest Knight, and then everything else just replace Well of Darkness with hit dice. And it turns it into something really, really interesting and cool. And that's really all it is. When we talk about these subclasses, this doesn't even damage, it doesn't even hurt these subclasses other than the Dark Magus. And when we go over the Dark Magus, I will talk about the issues I have with it and whatever changes might be needed to made to make it work with this new version of the Dark Knight. But overall, like I said, I really like the Dark Knight. I think it's an interesting class. The Well of Darkness is a completely wasted ability. And if you just change it into hit dice and take Burning Blood completely out of the class, because you already get a fighting style at level 2, but Burning Blood really isn't necessary once we turn it into hit dice. And the fighting style is a big enough change that you're not going to feel, cheated at the second level by just getting a fighting style, because it is going to massively change how you play the class very, very early. So, yeah, I would say get rid of Burning Blood entirely, change Well of Darkness. You can keep the name Well of Darkness, but just change it from Well of Darkness points to hit dice. And then the rest of this works really, really well. Other than, like I said, change Abyssal Communion to improve Blackest Knight, and basically that would mean at the 13th level, when you use Blackest Knight, when you roll your hit die, you get double the amount of temporary hit points, and go ahead and double your charisma modifier to 2, just because it will work, and it'll make it viable going into tier 3 and tier 4 content. So other than that, it's a cool class. It's really interesting. The next episode of this, we're going to dive into the subclasses. But yeah, otherwise, again, that is all for me today. In the comments down below, let me know what kind of flavor of the Dark Knight would you like. Do you really think having a dual wielding Dark Knight would be super, super cool? Do you prefer the Final Fantasy XIV version where they just carry a greatsword around and smite people? Let me know that in the comments down below. Otherwise, again, that is all for me today, and I will see you guys next time. All right? Bye-bye.